Thank you. Yeah. So I'm here to talk about AI in healthcare. I think AI in healthcare is one kind of sector where, when if you're like searching for like images of kittens and stuff like that, it's all okay, or you're generating those things. But when you try to deploy that in healthcare or technologies that use this advanced AI, where you have patients' life at risk and like based on your predictions, things do get pretty serious. So I'll be talking about the ML life cycles that very much correlates with like what the FDA has, and the key challenges we face in the AI in healthcare industry. But before we start, I want to give like a quick introduction to one of our product, which is towards uh, blood loss estimation. This is a product that we have been working almost since 2013. And in surgical environments, what happens is there are surgical sponges which are used to wipe blood continuously. And the way it's kind of, if you have to look at what amount of hemoglobin loss that has happened, it used to happen through visual estimation. And well, we humans are pretty bad at, we have like a consistent bias and stuff like that. And given the advent of AI, we were thinking like, hey, can we use machine learning to actually, estimate the amount of hemoglobin loss that's happening real time? And we were also looking into a lot of like medical devices. Should we create our own medical device? And well, the best device is the one that you carry around with you. And we were like, hey, can we create like an app that basically scrub nurses have with them? They always have an iPhone, and we can install this app on them. And when they go into an OR room, they have our app with us. So this is, next is a quick demo of how we use this. So that is a surgical sponge, and they just show this surgical sponge in front of the iPhone, and we, in real time, tell them hey, what is the amount of hemoglobin loss and the blood loss that has happened. So it uses advanced AI, which is like sponge detection, sponge segmentation, and this happens post-surgery. So they keep on wiping it, they throw it in a bucket, and they put it one by one, they just remove the sponges, surgical sponges, and they show it in front of the iPad, and then you have the entire blood loss at the end of the operation cycle. And this really helps, especially in C-section surgeries, because there's a high risk of hemorrhages that happens, because you cannot quantify. If I give you like 2 canisters of blood, because the concentration of hemoglobin is not linear, there is a high chance of hemorrhagic failure. So you can in real time monitor like how much amount of hemoglobin loss, blood loss that has happened, and then administer it without losing critical time from the OR room itself. We have had around 265,000 Triton assisted, that's our product, every year in the United States. And we are growing our customer base quite quickly. So this is our product, and we have been shifting to iPad based on the requirements of the nurses. They are saying, hey, the iPhone is kind of small. Can we move on to something big? We were like, hey, what's the next big product we have? We have an iPad. So that was our product. And we also give life update. Like if there is a case of hemorrhage, we inform the nurses and anybody like who would be involved in the hemorrhage protocol in order to mitigate the risk. We were also like first company which we got a de novo. De novo is like a unique kind of a classification for a medical devices, because we were like pretty much first in this field in blood loss quantification. So let me give you like, you are developing AI technologies, but how different is it in medical domain? So in FDA, that is in United States, the Food and Drug Administration, that broadly classifies all the medical devices you see into 3 categories based on risk. So the risk one is a low risk category. That's like maybe devices like toothbrush. That's a class 1. And a lot of medical devices do fall in, AI-enabled devices fall in class 1 or class 2. The class 2 is a medium risk. One of them can be your contact lenses. Those are class 2. And class 3 are the high risk ones where we haven't seen AI-enabled devices. These are essentially life-supporting devices. Pacemaker can be one of them. FDA also looks into like the kind of AI models or the algorithms you develop, and it broadly categorizes into, hey, is it a fixed one. So if you give a fixed input at any time, you get a fixed output, and another model that is continuously learning on the fly. Also, FDA would classify AI that you develop on this device as a software as a medical device. So if you have an app that's running on Apple platform, they would say, hey, it's a software as a medical device. And looking at the landscape, we have seen like a lot of companies that are in the radiology space, because that's one of the, well, that has a lot to do with data, because this radiology, it's kind of quite easy to kind of have access to radiology artifacts like chest X-rays and stuff, and it just keeps on going down. So talking about ML lifecycle, and especially in healthcare, you would have seen this chart of like, you start with the product definition, and then you start collecting data, you pre-process it, you train the models, you validate it, and then you deploy them and go about monitoring it. Like, what makes like additional steps that you would have to take in healthcare is like when you are starting your data collection, you might have to go with investigation device exemption, which means that, hey, I am going to collect real world data, and you need that approval for that, which can impact, if you are in a startup environment, can impact your timeline, because you might want to get the correct legal right of doing that. And data collection as well, of course, there is, we have HIPAA, which we want to prevent patient privacy, so that will also add like an extra layer of timeline creep that can happen. Once you start validating your product, like you have a machine learning model that's running, and then you have like an initial product that you want to release into the market, you would go through an FDA submission, and if it's a unique product, you will go through a de novo submission. And it goes through clinical trials, which can take anywhere from 12 months to 15 months on an average. And FDA also mandates you having a quality system, like quality system regulation is basically how your AI model is kind of performing in the field. And sometimes if your model fails, then you have to log that and say it's like what went wrong, and then take preventive action. So that's something FDA also mandates. So I'm going to talk about like 3 key challenges we face and 3 major domains of which is related to data. The explainable AI. People say like, when it comes to medicine, we want AI models that are robust and at the same time they're explainable, and model failures that you see while deploying them. So let's talk about data. Unique proposition with medical AI is like when you collect like the data that you are collecting, it has a wide impact. Basically, it has, it's patients like life at risk, or, there is a lot of sensitive information that you'll be working with and you'll be collecting. So even if you're not up for it, the way data is being generated, you will see a lot of artifacts. One is like, data fragmentation, where there are data that is like scattered all across the place. There is a sampling bias. Minorities need to know that like minorities are kind of severely impacted by their access to healthcare. There is treatment gaps. A lot of like surgeons, scrub nurses, they are humans at the end of the day, and they do have their own bias, and also in the way they collect data. There are certain practices which kind of, based on the recent evidence or recent research, they should not be performed, but they still are. And of course, there is this, whenever you start collecting this data, the real world itself has a lot of bias, and you start collecting data set which has bias embedded in it. And then the last thing is like the historical data, where, like people want to work, like when startups want to start developing the ML models, they kind of refer to the same data set again and again, which might have been collected maybe in early 2000s, and there has been a substantial data drift. The second important challenge that we face is in data privacy and data siloing. We have HIPAA, which is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which strives to protect patient privacy, but you will have access to major data points, like maybe the gender of the person, that can help, but of course, it's an anonymized data. Second thing is, of course, the hospital privacy. Sometimes if you want to take the data out of the hospital, if you have an agreement with them, they might have a limited bandwidth. So they would not allow you to transmit like gigabytes of data while they are operating. So maybe you have to transfer this data during the downtime. And then procurement of data itself takes because there's a legal entity involved. If you are a startup or you're working in the space, getting all those contracts in takes a lot of time, and that can impact your ML lifecycle. And in the US, because the data are fragmented, and so if you want to bundle everything together, it is a Herculean task, and you have to get everybody on board with what you're doing, patients included. One important solution that people usually talk about when you have data and especially privacy is a big concern is working with federated learning, where you basically have this local models deployed in health clinics all across the country, and then you basically have a local model that's running, and then you have a global model. There are certain drawbacks to this. One major one is like you have to ensure that that you, in your entire pipeline, you are no longer your patient data is no longer fragmented. So if you're like just working with one modality, let's say for example chest X-rays, then life is easier. But then if you have like multiple stages of treatment, and that requires multiple data points and multiple institutions that are involved, then maybe you would want to go about like finding solutions of how to patch things up. But federated learning, there is one, especially in the field of pathology, we have seen like quite promising results is, if you change the substrate or like the reagent that you're using for testing, that varies a lot. And a lot of times it's like, depending on the part of the country or the preferences of the surgeons, the kind of drugs that are prescribed, they vary a lot. But like if somebody is going to the same clinic again and again, they are sort of getting similar prescriptions. And so that can kind of help us minimize the local variance that we see in data. And of course, the data never leaves the clinic. So that kind of a lot of hospitals or and AI in medicine, when we say it's like hospitals or these clinics basically act as data custodians. So they're kind of happy that we are not routing this data out. So talking about explainable AI, because a lot of people are saying, they have this concern. It's like, hey, you're using AI for treating a certain ailment and stuff. And I don't know if I trust AI. And that's a very legitimate question. So let me give you like the first example. It's like we are looking at like, for example, breast cancer detection, which, and you have an AI which looks at certain part of the images, and it says like, hey, I think it's a triplet loss, or it detects like certain regions or lesions within the image and say, hey, I see certain patterns here, and based on this, I think it's a tumor, and I think it's maybe a certain type of it. Now the AI would actually tell like, hey, this particular slide that you have given me has a cancer cell in that, and it's of a certain type, and this will help a pathologist actually make a decision. But you have an expert at the end who will look into this results. But there are certain times where you do not need to give sort of an explanation. Like one good example is like you have a certain hospital which wants to look at stretchers. It's like if they are not lying around, or they want to know if a stretcher is coming into an intensive care, and they have one important concern. It's like, hey, I have this device that you have, like a camera. I just want to ensure that you're not looking at the patients, or you're not recording the activities of maybe healthcare workers or the patient, and you're just looking at the stretcher. And if a hospital has that query, you can go ahead and say, well, my ML model using like one of the explainable techniques is looking at the stretcher and not at the person. So we have like based on the application, explanation can be necessary and explanation cannot be. But like that brings us to the topic is like in medicine, and do the AI models have to be explainable? And the question is like, frankly, it depends. But a lot of times, just keeping a black box approach kind of helps, because if your ML model fails, and in the field, it can fail, there can be a lot of model failures. If the end user sees like there's a disagreement between what they thought and what the current AI has predicted, then they say, hey, there is a disagreement, and I feel the AI is wrong here. And so I'm going to default to my clinical judgment, and I'm going to proceed with that. So in our experience, models don't have to be interpretable. And in a way, keeping them as a black box does definitely help. And we also, whenever we ship our products, we also say, hey, please default to your clinical judgment whenever you're using your products. But a lot of time, they do work quite well. And AI models have been shown in certain tasks, they perform relatively better. So talking about AI failures, uh, one of the biggest ones that we see in medical industry is towards like hardware issues. If you have a camera, let's say you're working towards like working on an endoscopic operation, you have an AI model that's deployed on this endoscopy. What happens is like maybe they did not calibrate the device, maybe they did not clean the device, so they, before operation they would wipe the surfaces, but did not wipe the endoscope lens really well, and so you get like a distorted image. Um, there is external environments in which it can have an adverse effect. So, for example, is an external lighting condition. So, if your application is kind of very sensitive to color, which for an example is endoscopy itself, that you want to look at the internal, if there is any sort of internal bleeding or bruising, and if it's not calibrated correctly or things like that, then that's going to impact you as well. There is knowledge limits. Is sometimes you get like a blood image, for example, for pathology applications. And if you had a human in the loop, what would happen is like they would maybe look at an X-ray, for example, and say, "Hey, I got like the X-ray didn't come clearly. I want to take another." Collect more data on that, or just take another X-ray. But over here, knowing that where your model sort of fails, and having like guardrails in order to prevent that. For example, in our applications, what we told is like, if you show a red, like a bloodied sponge, and then it says it's 0 gram of hemoglobin. Well, we want to have certain guardrails in order to prevent like AI from predicting those wrong things. And the last thing is model drift. And in medicine and medical AI and medical devices, it's quite important to keep a tab on what data you're generating and continuously evaluate your machine learning models against the newly generated data. One of the recent examples I can give you is related to COVID, because COVID did impact certain, like for example, in X-rays and detections, there can be overlapping conditions that can impact your ML model, and so eventually you will drift away. Your ML models will drift away. So it doesn't mean that your ML model is wrong. It's not just currently trained on the latest data. So you might want to look as like, hey, is there any event that has happened that can impact my ML model? So basically start looking into that. And FDA will have like, this is an old terminology, we call it CAPA, which is corrective and preventive action. If something goes wrong in the field, people will raise flags, and you have to go and address that concern based on the severity of how big of a problem that is, and if you have to recall the product, or basically you go about debugging what went wrong in that situation, whether it was a model issue, whether it was a hardware issue, whether it's we went into like certain sort of a knowledge limits. So to summarize. Healthcare and AI teams, like the teams that weren't in healthcare and medicine, they have to tackle the data biases and be cognizant of that, which means like keep your ears open and like speak with the patients, with the hospitals, and saying like, hey, I observe certain patterns. Can you please just elaborate on that? Or like who's getting impacted and by how much? Interpretability is required for developing a basic trust line. Of course, people usually say like interpretability and accuracy are, it's like they don't go hand in hand. I think they can go hand in hand, but if you have a highly interpretable model, but which is not accurate, then people will no longer use the product, and you have a bigger problem at hand. And we want in medical AI, especially when most of the devices belong to class 1 or class 2, and they're assisting pathologists or the scrub nurses, we want that in case your models fail, we want them to default to the clinical judgment so that they can make a better decision. And the last thing is you have to continuously keep on monitoring once you release your product for the latest data and like how your model is performing. And if there is a substantial drift, then go about submitting a new update, which goes to a special 510K. FDA has been kind of kind to us, and that realm is like, hey, if I have to update a model, it's not that much of a lengthy process. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.